respectful. We just started recording this meeting. Hi, everybody. I hope you're all doing well today. My name is Chloe Hundell. I'm the grant specialist at NACD, and this is the webinar for the Partnership for Climate-Smart Commodities program, specifically regarding the request for proposals for project grants. So a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. Please make sure to mute yourself if you haven't already, and try to stay muted throughout the meeting to reduce distractions. Also, if you have any questions, you can enter the questions into the chat box. We'll address your questions at the end of the presentation in the order that they came in. Also, if you're on a phone and you're unable to use the chat box, we'll give you some time at the end to ask any questions that you have if you weren't able to use the chat box during the presentation. And then again, as a reminder, this meeting will be recorded. It'll be shared to anybody who registered, and it'll also be shared on our website so that you can access it and you can share it with anybody else who's interested in watching the recording. Just a quick overview of what we're going to cover today. So right now we're in the welcome section. So just letting you guys know what we're talking about, which is the Climate-Smart Commodities RFP. We'll have a brief program overview, and then we'll get into some details of the RFP and the application process. We'll go over the program requirements, and then we'll open it up for questions. So I'm going to pass it over to our Chief Program Officer, Jen Nelligan, who's going to do a little bit of the program overview for you.
Thanks, Chloe. Hi, everyone. Hope you're having a great afternoon. Actually, before I get started, our CEO, Jeremy Peters, is on. So, Jeremy, I might pass it to you to provide a quick welcome, and then I can kind of get into some of the programmatic details.
Yeah, thank you, Jen, and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, and glad you're able to participate in the webinar today. Really pleased with all of the responses that we received last year to the call for concept papers. And so this webinar is a follow-up at the next phase of the process for NACD's Climate-Smart Commodities program to really start to flesh out some of those concepts into full proposals and to really begin to understand what implementation of these concepts will begin to look like. So really first want to just applaud the team, our staff and our leadership to getting us to this point and making great progress in terms of implementation, and really looking forward to getting down to actual practice adoption and implementation in the coming year. But first and foremost, we've got to get these proposals fully developed and fleshed out, make sure that all parties are good, and then get down to implementation. Just a few observations. One is, we really appreciate the locally led concepts that folks have brought forward. These are great opportunities for district-led and supported engagements that will advance the delivery of conservation practices and the climate-smart practices under the program in partnership with some of the organizations and companies that have stepped forward through the concept paper phase. We're really excited to see just the level of passion and creativity and the types of engagements, the new potential partnerships, and the ways that we can continue to strengthen local economies, producer livelihoods, and locally led conservation. I should mention that we received over 100 concept papers, totaling about $420 million worth of projects. So really strong response to the call for concepts. And so we're looking forward to getting as many of those funded as we can. And we've met with about half of the submitting organizations to provide feedback and to suggest potential partners. Many of you have already reached out to the conservation programs team for feedback, but if you've not yet done so, you can certainly email climate@nacdnet.org to be able to set up a time to have that conversation. So we're really eager to be able to support our conservation district members. We're eager to be able to develop some of these new partnerships and projects through this process. So looking forward to this next phase, and thank you to the team to getting us to this point. Also, thanks to each of you for stepping into this opportunity with us and to continue to explore how we can be impactful, how we can really showcase the locally led conservation process in the Climate Smart Commodities program. So Jen, I'll turn things back to you and look forward to the rest of the webinar.
Thanks, Jeremy. Chloe, could you switch to the next slide, please? Thanks. So just wanted to give a little bit more framing in some of the observations that we made through the concept paper phase. So first of all, I think many of you saw this either through USDA's process or also through our RFP, that ultimately each of the final proposals has to have three main components. The first one being scale of climate smart practices, the second being in quantification and MRV, and then the third one's really important as well to meet the needs of the Commodity Credit Corporation, which is the funding source for this grant. And that's developing or expanding markets for the resulting climate smart commodities. So part of why we ended up with this multi-phase process is because even having gone through it ourselves, we recognize how challenging it could be to develop such complex projects that hit so many factors and have so many objectives. And so we were really excited by, as Jerry had mentioned, the creativity and innovation that we saw not only across various commodities and operations, but also across the country. As Jeremy mentioned, we received about 100 concept papers for projects. We noted that there were so many that had really strong outreach and technical assistance strategies. So kudos to the conservation districts and all of our partners. That was not surprising to us. We were really excited to see that. We also saw really good quantification methods and MRV plans in many of the papers. But some of them didn't quite have that. So I'd say if you're still looking for an MRV partner, we did have a lot of submissions from various firms or other partners that have really strong capabilities. This might include organizations with either technologies or capabilities that can simplify and streamline the monitoring and reporting process, including some, I think, relatively low effort approaches to constantly monitor soils and provide real-time data to producers. So if you are looking for a partner in that space, feel free to reach out to us using the climate@nacd.org email address, and we'd be glad to connect you further. I think where we really saw the competitive edge was having a clear and realistic plan for developing and expanding markets. And so a lot of you, when we had these conversations, were asking, well, what does that really mean? And so I just wanted to take the time to clarify that when we think about climate smart commodities markets, it's not just carbon markets. It can include even super local markets for the commodities that are being produced, like farmers markets, restaurants, farm to school programs, hospitals, and so on. I think I'd share, and actually Chloe will go through this in a bit as she walks through the application and our evaluation criteria, but there are a few different ways to think about developing a market plan. USDA is asking, I think, a few key questions, right? So this would be the 50,000-foot overview. But one, USDA is looking to see whether producers are being paid for premium for the actual commodity being produced. And if so, is it a premium on the actual commodity, or is it in the form of maybe a carbon or an outcomes payment? And the second question is really around what we'll kind of classify broadly as narrative claims and marketing strategies. So USDA is also very curious as to whether folks are how project partners and how producers are differentiating between their commodity, which was grown or raised using climate smart practices, versus all of the other ones. So there's a question as to whether they're using any sort of labels, whether that's climate smart, regenerative, sustainable, or so on. Who are you using this with, and how will this project help create awareness and demand for the commodities that are climate smart? And just another piece is that the markets, like I mentioned, can be national or local. As a national organization, I think through the matchmaking process, what we saw is that a lot of the potential market partners are national, even though they might have regional projects. But we didn't really have much contact or many contacts with like either state or local market partners. And so I think that in many of the projects, and if you'd like to chat with us to kind of brainstorm what that looks like, we'd be happy to. But in many cases, I think we'd look to the grantees to maybe bring in those other contacts or partners that we just might not be able to reach, being a national organization. And so just really briefly before I pass it over to Chloe to get into the meat of the application, I just wanted to give a quick update on where we are with matchmaking. As you might have seen in some of our communications, we did extend the matchmaking phase through January. Part of that is because we did receive a really overwhelming response, and that was really exciting. And we've also been working through a lot of the new practices and field trials and deviations that you had all proposed, and trying to pull all of that together for USDA's review. And so the state association, well, NACD had shared all of the concept papers with the state associations, who I know spent a lot of time sharing that information with their respective districts. Some have already expressed interest in meeting with potential partners, but I just use this time as a reminder that if you haven't done so already, I think we had established January 19th as the date, and that would be really helpful as we're beginning to schedule introductory meetings between partners who are interested in connecting further with the districts, as well as the state associations and districts in the areas that they're looking to work in. So in the interim, we're starting to set up those introductions. You'll be seeing some of those notices over the next couple of weeks. They're just informal meetings at this time. They're a way for you to learn more about the concept, as well as begin the process to further scope that project, right? So we expect that partners will work with state associations, conservation districts, and other folks over the next couple of months to really start to define what those project roles and responsibilities are, refine deliverables, environmental outcomes and metrics, as well as the budgets, of course. So we really appreciate your interest and creativity and dedication to conservation, of course. We're really excited about these next few phases of the grant. And so with that, I'll pass it on to Chloe to jump into the details of the RFP, the application, and the evaluation criteria. Thanks, Chloe.
Great, thank you, Jen. Yeah, so as she said, I'm going to talk about the RFP details and go a little bit over the application. So let's dive in. So this is the request for proposals for project grants. So just to clarify, these are for project grants and not the planning and capacity grants. The planning and capacity grants are going to have a separate RFP, and that'll be coming soon. So keep an eye out for that, but this is a separate RFP for projects. So the proposals will be due on March 15th. And the application portal hasn't opened yet. So now is the time to look over the materials on the request for proposals, which also includes all of the application questions, and kind of start planning your proposal before that portal opens, and also determining if you need to reach out to us to ask any questions in advance of the application portal opening. So you'll be really prepared when that is ready to go. So we have approximately $80 million in pass-through funds, so the funds that will go to our grantees, and then approximately 42 million, or about half of that, is dedicated to financial incentives that will go directly to producers to implement climate-smart practices. The maximum award for any project is $5.75 million, but we do have 4 funding pools that your project might fall into, depending on how much you're requesting and then how much match that you're able to provide. Just a note for planning and capacity that the pools will be different as well. So we'll have a separate webinar to cover that. So for pool A, it's $2.5 million to $5.75 million in award funding, and that's a 50% match requirement, or a 1-to-1 match requirement. So when we say 50%, that means 50% of the total project budget. So if you're requesting $100,000 and you are matching 50%, then you're matching $100,000 for a total project budget of $200,000. I guess I should say $2.5 million with a $2.5 million match would be a $5 million total project. That's 50% coming from NACD and 50% being provided by the grantee in the form of non-federal match. So it's important to also note that match cannot be federal funding. We cannot match federal dollars to other federal dollars. So all the match has to be from non-federal sources. Pool B is any projects between $1 million and $2.5 million, and that'll have a 30% match requirement. And again, that's 30% of the total project budget. Pool C is $750,000 to $1 million with a 20% match requirement. Anything that's $750,000 or lower. And that will have a 15% match requirement, but it's important to note that match may be waived for Pool D, as well as for planning and capacity grants, if 100% of the project serves underserved producers. So we'll get more into what qualifies as an underserved producer, but you can also refer to our Climate-Smart Commodities FAQ document on the website for more information on that. So if the project is serving 100% underserved producers, there's a possibility of match being waived specifically for Pool D. So the evaluation criteria, this is in section 3.5 of the RFP, if you'd like to look at that for more details, but I'll do a brief overview. So 20% of your evaluation will be based on the technical approach. So this includes your approach to project management, your outreach plan, your plan for MMRV, and your market development plans. So it's just important to note that the evaluators of these projects will be assessing the strength of your approaches. So being as clear and detailed and specific as possible will always work in your favor. 25% of the evaluation will be based on the benefits that are generated from the practice implementation. So keep in mind that carbon mitigation is the primary goal of this grant. So greenhouse gas benefits will be the key metric that we'll be evaluating when it comes to benefits. The goal of this program is to reduce or sequester over 1.5 million metric tons of CO2. But we will also consider environmental co-benefits such as water quality or biodiversity when we're looking at the benefits generated. And additionally, the goal for all projects is to implement climate smart practices on over 430,000 acres. So thinking about scaling benefits is important as well, and I'll get a little bit more into that in a bit. So 20% of the evaluation is based on the alignment to our goal of leaving no producer behind. So as I had noted, about half of the budget for these projects are dedicated to financial incentives that are going directly to producers to implement climate smart practices. So we have a goal, NACD has a goal of reaching 1,400 producers. And for 55% of the financial incentives that we're providing to go directly to underserved producers. And again, we'll get more into a bit about those goals for leaving no producer behind and reaching underserved producers in the next few slides. And then I had mentioned scaling. So USDA has a goal of scaling conservation practices through this program. So reaching new acres and reaching new producers. So there was a lot of interest in the concept papers with demonstration sites and field trials. So just keep the goal of scaling practice implementation in mind when you're developing your proposals and your applications, as well as your budgets and your metrics. So scaling is key. 20% of the evaluation will be based on your market development. So thinking about what makes a competitive market strategy, I know Jen had gotten into some detail, but in terms of what we're looking for as evaluators of your proposal, thinking about the strength and clarity. So being very clear about your marketing plan or approach. What is your approach to facilitating producers' meaningful participation in climate smart markets, as well as thinking about estimated market returns to those who are participating in your project. So again, specificity is key. And then also including commitments to or commitments from market partners on how you're going to work in this market. So if you don't have commitments, including plans for how you're going to obtain those commitments and how you're going to reach those partners or potential partners. So, and then 15% will be for other, which kind of covers a lot. I'll just go over it quickly. But this includes meaningfully engaging conservation districts or their associations. So this is really important that we're engaging conservation districts. So we're driving these projects at the local level. Cost effectiveness of the budget proposal is also important. So this will include the idea of scaling implementation, so reaching those new acres, how well you're able to reach underserved producers with the budget, the balance between scaling practices across many producers and acres, but also the use of funds for your trials and demonstrations that can influence change or a greater adoption of practices. We'll also be taking a look at your overhead or indirect cost rates. I'm not going to get into detail on indirect here, but if you want more information, we do have an indirect cost policy on the website, and I'm happy to work with anybody directly. If you want to reach out to me, we can talk about it more in detail. If you have any past grants with NACD, your past performance could come into play in your evaluation. If you haven't had any past grants, it's not going to count against you. It's just, if you have had a past grant, we'll kind of look at, if you were submitting timely and accurate reports on time, et cetera. We'll also be thinking about how projects can fit into the broader portfolio of projects that we're awarding for this program. So we want to have a diversity of projects that includes geography, size, scale, types of commodities, types of operations. So thinking about having a diverse portfolio of projects will factor into our evaluation of our applications. Also thinking about the risk and feasibility of your project, whether from a financial, technical, or programmatic standpoint. And then lastly, the sustainability of your project. So how it's going to be sustained over the years. I know that's a lot to fit into that 15%, but that's a quick overview. And again, if you want to look at section 3.5 of the RFP for more details, please do so. Lastly, I'm going to cover for this section the application instructions. So as I had mentioned, the application portal is coming in February 2024. It's going to be in a new system, and so that will be shared widely for those of you interested in applying. But for now, you have the access to all of the questions in the application in the RFP, so you can take a look at that. The application questions start in section 4.2 of the RFP. There's going to be 4 parts to the proposal. So the first one is the technical proposal. And these are going to be your written answers. And so again, there's the list of questions. You can start thinking about answers now. There's also going to be some multiple choice questions. And I should note that the multiple choice questions are tied to USDA reporting requirements that come with this program. And so it ensures that we are getting clear responses from you that are aligned with USDA's expectations and requirements. So if you need additional context on any of the questions, you might find that in the data dictionary. Maybe check there first, and then you can reach out to us if you have more questions. We'll go over the technical proposal will also cover the measuring, monitoring, reporting, and verification plans that you have for your project. It will go over your plans for distributing financial incentives. And again, just want to emphasize financial incentives are strictly for practice implementation. So paying producers to implement practices. You'll also be indicating the practices and environmental outcomes that you're proposing, and then marketing plan for distributing information about your project. The next section will be the budget table. So the template is available in the the RFP. And just a note with the budget, it will go, there'll be categories for the lead partner, the project partner, and then also contractors. So the lead partner will be the grantee, the applicant that is applying for this funding. Project partners will be any subawardees, and they'll fall under the other category in the budget. And then there's contractors. If you are going to use contractors, make sure that you're following the Code of Federal Regulations. It's 2 CFR 200 procurement standards for contractors. If you need help determining what those are, you can reach out to me. The next section will be a budget narrative. This will correspond to the budget table. It will describe the expenses that you're anticipating for each line item and how the costs were estimated and how the expense will contribute to the project deliverables. And then lastly, we'll have certification and letters of support. So all applicants will be required to certify that you've read the data dictionary and that you understand the quarterly reporting requirements. In addition to the certification, you can submit letters of support. And I really want to emphasize getting letters of support from your local conservation districts and or their respective associations. So we can ensure that we're supporting our members and that projects are supported by locally led conservation. And then one last note, just keep in mind that this is a grant from NACD. This is not a cooperative agreement with NRCS. So NRCS is only needs to support the inherently governmental functions. So things like issuing farm and tract numbers, making wetland determinations, or approving your CPA 52 forms, but they won't be working with you as a grantee directly on outreach, enrollment, or any other activity that has to do with your program implementation. So we want to be good partners with NRCS and making sure that we're gathering the information that they're looking for and reporting. But the projects should not be engaging NRCS directly or relying on NRCS for their expertise or their capacity or anything like that. So just a heads up in terms of the relationship, NRCS is providing these funds to NACD and you're working as a grantee of NACD to implement the program. Okay, so next I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Latrina Staley, who's our equity and outreach program analyst, and she's just going to give you a quick reminder of some of the program requirements that we went over in the last webinar.
Excuse me, I'm sorry, I don't want to interrupt, but could she repeat the contractor part again? Because if there's any way that she can repeat that slide.
Yeah, so I was just saying that if you are using contractors, that you will have to use the Code of Federal Regulations. It's 2 CFR 200. There's guidance for procurement in that Code of Federal Regulations that you'll be required to follow for procuring contractors for your projects. If you need more information on that, I can get into it at the end of the presentation, or you can reach out to us directly. We'll have contact information at the end of the presentation.
Yeah, and I think that's also covered in the FAQ, just kind of the long story short, but USDA does require certain thresholds for competition depending on the dollar value. So if it's not in the FAQ already, we can clarify it, but that is what Chloe is referring to. It's not sole source and it's competing where required, and then having the documentation behind it. So thank you for those questions. Lutrina, will pass it to you for some of the program requirements. Thanks.
Thank you so much. If you could go to the next slide, please. It is our goal that with this grant funding, we can reach customers and producers and farming communities that we have not engaged with before. In fact, one important item that will be evaluated on applications will be the recipient's approach and commitment in serving producers, especially those underserved producers or those who are new to conservation districts and NRCS. Climate-Smart funding provides NACD with a unique opportunity to affect the implementation of conservation on land at scale. This funding will allow us to bring new customers to the table while incentivizing producers to choose conservation systems and practices for their farming operations. A farm and tract number are essential for producers receiving this funding. The farm number is one of the 3 ways a farmer identifies as a farmer for government purposes. The USDA farm programs are administered locally through county-based Farm Service Agency and Natural Resource Conservation Service offices. The FSA office is where farmers register to get a farm number. They must have a farm number to apply for FSA farm loans, disaster assistance, crop insurance, and NRCS programs like the Environmental Quality Incentive Program. The grant recipients will be responsible for advocating for the producers who still need a farm and tract number by assisting with applying. Recipients need to be prepared to help with this process. In this process, AGI doesn't apply. The highly erodible land and wetland conservation compliance forms are required for eligibility. Compliance with both the highly erodible land, I'll call it HELC, and WC, the wetland conservation, is required of producers participating in NACD's Climate-Smart Commodities grant. If a participating producer is not experienced with these forms, the grantee should work with the producer to help them understand the process, introduce them to the local NRCS office, and help the producer initiate the certification process via Form AD 1026. Providing support in this area gives us a unique opportunity to engage with a population new to the soil and water conservation districts and USDA programs, and form lasting relationships that builds trust and helps us understand the unique needs and resource concerns that we may not have heard of before or are not traditional. We are here to provide support to the recipients and a guidance document that lists the documents needed when applying for a farm and tract number and alternate documentation for farmers with heirs property issues. And I'm actually going to drop a link to that form in the chat in just a moment. For more information, you can find this information in the FAQ on pages 18 to 22. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. Just wanted to kind of bring this back to everyone's mind as far as what the definitions of underserved producers are. There are beginning farmers and ranchers, socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers, veterans farmers and ranchers, limited resource farmers and ranchers, women farmers and ranchers, and producers growing specialty crops. So please keep that in mind. And I'll turn it back over to Chloe. Thank you.
I turn it over to Chessa, who is our grants administrator,
Thanks, Chloe.
to cover these next slides.
Thanks, Chloe. Climate-smart conservation plans are similar to the traditional USDA conservation plan and involve creating a comprehensive strategy that will identify key sources for conservation while promoting the adoption of climate-smart practices among producers and stakeholders. We anticipate that 13,000 climate-smart conservation plans will be developed through this program. These plans may be developed through climate-smart funding or other traditional sources such as EQIP, CSP, or a state-specific program. Climate-smart plans require the use of Comet Planner. That's one key difference. Through Comet Planner, various conservation approaches are explored. It helps in designing customized plans that balance agricultural productivity with environmental conservation, taking into account the specific needs and challenges of the area. This comprehensive approach will include cost comparisons of new practices versus the status quo, 3 to 5 year cost scenarios, potential market incentives or opportunities, and identification of incentive funds. Incentive funds may include NACD financial incentives through this program, traditional USDA conservation programs, state-specific conservation funding, or private sector financial assistance. We'll get a little bit more into the incentives in a few slides. Okay, I think that's everything on that side. Can we jump to the next one? Part of the planning process is to have a cultural resource review or an environmental review completed. USDA completed a programmatic review in 2022 and updated which practices do not require a review. The list of practices are on the slide. These practices had a finding of no significant impact. Over the next few years, this list may change. There are still some situations where you may need to do a review, even if you're implementing practices on this list. If you're doing practices in addition to those on the slide, you'll still need to do a site review. A review is also required if there are significant impacts to public health and safety, significant effects on unique characteristics of geographic areas, such as the proximity to a historic property or cultural resources, parklands, prime farmland, floodplains, wetlands, wild and scenic rivers, or ecologically critical areas. Highly controversial effects on quality or human environment, or highly uncertain effects, including potential, unique, or unknown risks to human environments. If you're working with a producer on any suite of practices, at least one of the practices needs to have an environmental review completed. And we'll get a little bit more into that on the next slide, please. Grant recipients are responsible for working with the producers to complete their site-specific evaluations using the CPA 52 form. This form will be completed through Section O. That form is available on the internet, but if you can't find it, shoot us an email and we'll send it over to you. After you've completed the form, you'll submit it to USDA using a link. We can send that link out too if you need it, or and then USDA will review and approve that form and send it back to the grantee for inclusion with the producer's file. Practices listed on this slide require site-specific reviews. NACD was not able to anticipate all the potential climate-smart practices that would be implemented under these projects. As such, NACD is committed to working with our partners and applicants to identify practices for USDA consideration and approval. Grantees must identify and propose specific practices that are expected to be implemented under their proposed projects. USDA will review these requests, determine whether an additional site-specific review is required, and amend our grant agreement to reflect those specific requirements. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the financial incentives. The cost share program is set up using NACD standards forms. We have agreement forms that you can use as well as for the schedule of operations. It's a 3-party agreement between the producer, the lead organization, and NACD. As part of our services, NACD will handle the producer payments and the agreements. Grantees are not required to handle the payments or manage the flow of payments to producers. Incentive payments will be completed for implementation consistent with the agreement. Project leads are responsible for review, inspection, and certification of the design and installation of all practices. Like Chloe mentioned, if you're going to need a contractor, make sure that's included in your proposal. Under this program, producers also have the option to receive the financial incentive directly, or they can have the funds reassigned to an implementation partner. That process will be decided during the planning phase, working with your producers. Underserved producers may be eligible to receive up to 50% of their incentives in advance. Projects are going to follow NRCS's EQIP payment program for underserved producers to determine if they are eligible to receive advance payments. Pass this over to Jen, NACD's Chief Program Officer.
Thanks, Chessa. So I wanted to take a bit of an opportunity to talk about field trials. We saw a lot of them proposed in the concept papers, but many of them didn't quite meet the definition that we had initially outlined in the FAQ. So in the revised FAQ that we issued last month, we did take the opportunity to just clarify that definition. So wanted to just maybe go over kind of the 3 big ones that we saw here. And so we are really clarifying field trials, at least for the purposes of this grant, to focus on practices that do not currently have an NRCS conservation practice standard or an interim standard. So, those are basically for, situations where there is quite a bit of science and quite a bit of research that demonstrates the efficacy of that practice, but perhaps it's not adopted at that wider scale and does not have a practice standard. And so in that case, that's when NACD would fund the practice implementation at 100%. When we sort of dove into a lot of the concepts and proposals, we found that a lot of the requests that were classified as conservation field trials, many of them were actually practice deviations. And that's where, in a situation where there is an existing practice standard or an interim standard, but you're looking to maybe change something about that. So in a lot of cases, for example, we saw field trials for existing practices like cover crops, but perhaps it's, one of the varieties that's not in in NRCS's practice standards today. So in those cases, just as an FYI, we did submit all of the new practices that aren't currently approved for NACD, as well as all of the requested practice deviations to USDA. So they are still considering those. We don't have answers yet, but I just wanted to kind of share that we're still working with USDA to move those through. And so in that case, assuming that USDA approves the practice deviations, those would be subject to cost share. Similarly, we saw a lot of field demonstrations classified as field trials as well. And so, I think we just, as Chloe talked about those quite a bit, so I won't get into the same detail. I'd say that we really recognize the importance of demonstrations and the impact that they can have on influencing adoption rates. But just, as she had mentioned, there is going to be a balance between demonstrations and, scaling practices on new acres and with new producers. So when you're thinking about your proposals and your budgets, that's just an important balance to consider and to strike. Yeah, and so demonstrations as well, the practices that are implemented as part of those will also be subject to cost share. And we do have a little bit more information in our FAQ as well as some examples if it's helpful. But as always, feel free to reach out to the team if there's anything in particular you'd like to discuss, or if you have specific questions as to how your strategy might fall into one of these 3 buckets. Could you switch to the next slide, Chloe? I'll also go over USDA's reporting requirements fairly quickly. I know that there are probably some questions in the chat, so we certainly want to make sure folks have an opportunity to ask those. But I highly encourage you to download the reporting toolkit on our website if you haven't done that already, and familiarize yourself with the workbook. We're required to report several things to USDA on a quarterly basis, and that's at these levels here. So there are field, farm, and producer levels, as well as activities done at the partner and project level. There are about 10 worksheets in that workbook, and there are quite a few data fields in them. So that's why we really want to make sure that as potential grantees, you've had an opportunity to look at the workbook and get a good sense of, what the reporting requirements will be each quarter. Can you shift to the next slide, actually, because that one gets into a little bit more detail. Yeah, so thank you. So the team put together this summary of the different types of data components that USDA will be requesting either on a quarterly or an annual basis. As I mentioned, they have about 10 worksheets. I'd say that we're all a little bit concerned because the worksheets themselves are kind of cumbersome to use, but it's really not too bad in terms of the data that we have to collect as you start to get into it and familiarize yourself with it, but it can be a little bit overwhelming at first. So NACD is in the process of implementing a new grants management system, which includes a more simplified way of collecting and reporting this data. So we're hoping that a simplified user interface and experience might help with the reporting, and particularly as we have to aggregate it across all of the grantees on a quarterly basis and submit that over to USDA. As we kind of go through the process, we'll continue to add information onto the website as it's available, but there are also some trainings that might be helpful as you think through, how do we actually report this? What does this mean? USDA's data dictionary is fairly lengthy, but it does have a lot of detail in terms of, well, when we say this metric, what does it mean? And what are the various potential responses that are attached to that? And also, as we move through the actual grant and award process, we'll work more closely with the selected grantees to refine the specific metrics and outcomes that would need to be reported. So I'll stop there. We can probably spend an hour on the reporting workbook, but we won't do that to you today, and we'll set up additional times and trainings as is needed as we get closer to that award phase. So I'll pass it to Kanisha, actually. I think she was going to facilitate or moderate some of the questions and answers.
Thanks so much, Jen. There are a couple questions in the chat, some of which were answered in the chat, but I'll still go ahead and just read those out loudly and the responses for those who might not have access to the chat. So Someone wanted to know if the slides would be shared after this webinar. The answer to that is yes. Along with the recording, they will be posted on our website. Do producer incentives have to be matched one-on-one? Producer incentives will be subject to cost share rates. So for example, 75% funded by NACD, 25% paid by the producer. Another question here, is there a projection of approximately how the $80 million will break down across projects, the different pools that Chloe talked about? And no, we don't have a specific breakdown of those, of that funding across pools. Jen is interested in understanding a little bit more about the evaluation of climate-smart markets. Would this mean that some third-party certification would be used to verify the practices as climate-smart, or maybe some other means? Jen, I think you're responding, but you're muted.
Thank you. Yeah. So Jen Elliott might need to reach out to you after to kind of clarify that question. So I think the third-party certifications to verify it, like that sounds more like something that would be a process that would be captured in your MRV plan. And that would be the process to like monitor and verify that the practices have been implemented, that you're quantifying the environmental outcomes and so on. The the climate-smart market piece is a little bit different, right? That's really about the sale of the commodity and whether producers are being paid a premium for that. So that can either be a premium in the form of like, well, we'll pay like 5 more cents for, this particular good, or the premium might be in the form of like a carbon credit or a carbon payment, right, for the actual environmental outcome that's generated from that. So I hope that helps, but I feel like I might not have answered your question, so I'm happy to dig into the question with you afterwards, and then we can put the response into the FAQ for everyone's benefit.
Thanks, Jen. I'm going to skip over the question about the contractors, because Jen did answer that one earlier. Our next question here is around the financial incentives and whether those will be passed directly from NACD to the producers or through the partners here. So for example, if compost application is part of the project, do we need to have NACD give the money directed to the producer to buy the compost, or can the RCD use grant funds to buy the compost and deliver it to the producer?
Yeah, so I'll maybe not answer that directly just yet, but generally, when it comes to producer payments, if it's for cost share for the practice and the producer's the beneficiary, right now, because we have such a large budget with $42 million, NACD will be distributing all of the payments directly to producers centrally. And that's largely because we want to make sure that we are able to pass audit, and we have a very consistent process for getting these payments out and verifying that the practices have been completed. In your example, Erin, that would be comparable. Yes, if the RCD is going to be purchasing all of the supplies and the equipment and such for the producer, and then distributing yourself, we could pay you guys directly for that. But do keep in mind that particularly when it comes to cost share for practice implementation, that the way that you should be estimating the value of that does need to be in line with, the EQIP cost share scenario, payment scenarios and such. So that's just something to keep in mind when you're calculating your budget and the cost of what the materials might be.
Thanks, Jen. Heather had a question around the practice list that were provided in the RFP. It is not the updated 2024 list, and Heather is asking whether those new practices that are on the 2024 list will be accepted as well.
Yeah, NACD can't unilaterally change its practice list, unfortunately. USDA has required that any practice that we don't currently have on there, whether it's a new practice or a deviation or a pilot, they do have to approve it. So I want to say it'll probably be easier to get that approved if it's already on that CSAF list, but we do have to go through USDA to make sure that that is the case.
Thanks. And then there's a final question in the chat from Dave. If we haven't been contacted by NACD since submitting the concept paper, does that mean the paper has been rejected?
No, not at all. We, as Jeremy had mentioned early on, we had been able to talk to about half of the submitters, but I think we had put out a note earlier on that if you'd like to have feedback or receive feedback, we'd be glad to sit down with you and set up some time to talk about how you might be able to strengthen your your concept paper for the final proposal, and whether or not there were districts interested in, potentially partnering with you on some of these projects. So we are hoping to see the rest of the district expressions of interest by January 19th. So we are still moving through that process. But again, these concept papers weren't formally evaluated, right? We assess them to, help connect various partners with districts or other members or even each other. We are providing feedback in terms of, how it might align to the scope of the grant and the goals, and, in some cases, what might be helpful to help strengthen it. But they're not formally evaluated or rejected. Everybody is welcome to submit a formal proposal should they like.
Thanks, Jen. All right, there are no more questions in the chat, but as Chloe mentioned earlier on in the webinar, if you're unable to access the chat or put your questions in the chat, but you do have a question that you would like for us to answer, now would be your time. If you can use the raise hand feature, that's great. If not, feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question. Hearing none, I know we might give folks just a second to get off mute. That's still a challenge after 3 years of doing virtual.
Yeah, but if nobody wants to maybe pop in right now, certainly feel free to reach out to the email address here, climate@nacdnet.org, or any of the team, and we'd be glad to answer any of your questions or brainstorm or provide feedback. And I saw, Yvonne, you had a question. The ideal way to receive feedback then is to contact you in the email in the slide. Yeah, that is the easiest. That way we can reach out and share the scheduling links and such. But typically, that's a phone call or a Teams call. It's just easier to have that rather than try to outline everything via email. So we'll set up some time to chat with you all if you're interested. All right. Well, thank you everyone for your time. Really appreciate it. We're really excited about these next few steps, and we can't wait to see the final proposals. Thanks everyone, and have a great afternoon.